Good day, everyone. My name is Chris Hine, and on behalf of the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, I'll be facilitating this webinar called Social Perceptions of the Environmental Effects of Offshore Wind Energy Development. This is a webinar through the U.S. Offshore Wind Synthesis of Environmental Effects Research Project, or SEER. Let's see. So for today's agenda, I'll just give a quick overview for SEER for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, or maybe it's a refresher for you, for several that do know about the project. Introduce our panelists for today, and start off with a panel discussion with our four presenters for about 30 minutes, and then towards the end, maybe the last 20 minutes or so, open it up for questions from the audience, and then we'll close out the webinar in the last few minutes. So the SEER project, as mentioned, is a joint co-led project through NREL and PNNL, and we're supported by the U.S. Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technologies Office to share information and resources on the environmental effects of wind energy. And so we've produced a number of research briefs on various stressor receptor relationships, such as the presence of vessels and the effects of vessel collision on marine life, or bird and bat interactions with offshore wind energy. We've also hosted a number of webinars over the past couple of years. So here's a QR code and link to the SEER webpage where you can access the various briefs, see recordings of our past webinars. Today's webinar will be posted soon after the conclusion, and so that can be viewed at a later time. We also have research recommendations on the TETHIS website that kind of summarize our information gaps, the barriers, current challenges for both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. So those are also available for viewing. And I want to introduce our four distinguished speakers, presenters today. We have Dr. Alison Bates, who is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Colby College. Dr. Bates researches social acceptance of renewable energy systems and implements an equity and justice framework to inform decision-making in the energy transition. She has more than a decade of experience researching offshore wind development and the possibilities for technical solutions to social challenges with floating wind. Dr. Bates has worked on national energy policy with U.S. Senator Coons to develop markets and policies for renewable energy infrastructure along the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf, and served in an advisory role with energy markets planning in Maine with state agencies, NGOs, and industry. She earned her PhD in marine policy at the University of Delaware Center for Carbon-Free Power Integration, and has many years of experience in the nonprofit sector for environmental education and public land conservation. Margaret Corby is a tribal engagement manager with the West Coast Ocean Alliance. Margaret brings together tribal nations on the West Coast and facilitates intertribal solidarity and dialogues around health, uses, and issues of the ocean. She has over a decade of experience working with and for coastal tribal nations in Oregon to expand capacity, improve consultation responsibilities, protect lifeways and sacred places, and assert the inherent sovereignty of tribes. She has extensive experience reviewing large, complex projects, analyzing and applying cultural resource protection regulation, and promoting accurate, appropriate, and meaningful tribal representation. She advocates for mutual decision-making and consensus-based approaches to advance inclusion of tribal expertise and perspectives. Margaret is based in Florence and Corvallis. She is a citizen member of the Confederate Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and the Siuslaw, and has roots in the Siuslaw and Coos Bay areas where her ancestors lived since time immemorial. Sarah Friedman is a community benefits advisor in the Office for the Undersecretary for Infrastructure. Sarah joined the Department of Energy in February of 2024. She has brought in by the Undersecretary for Infrastructure to support and improve community benefits commitments. Sarah started her career as an attorney in private practice at Chadbourne and Park on renewable project finance and development, followed by 8 years at Sierra Club, leading their work on renewable energy siting, including engaging in onshore and offshore wind. And most recently at Better World Group Advisors, where she supported coalition efforts around developing community and environmental protections for offshore wind and related development. Our last panelist today is Chris Olaf. Chris is a director for the Special Initiative of Offshore Wind. She has worked in the offshore wind sector for over 20 years, since the days of the industry's inception in the United States, and is a true expert in the field. Holding senior positions with offshore wind developers, NGOs, and state agencies, she has gained critical insights into the policy and regulations that shape offshore wind activities at the state, regional, and federal levels. Chris has worked at the critical intersection of market development, stakeholder engagement, permitting, and regulatory affairs as one of the earliest adopters of and advocates for offshore wind in the US. In her current role as the director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, she leads the organization to develop and implement strategies that support the responsibility and sustainable development of offshore wind. Originally from New Jersey, she is a Rutgers University graduate, has a master's degree from the University of Rhode Island, and currently lives in Morris County, New Jersey, with her husband and retired racing greyhounds. So please welcome our panelists. The combined experience of that we have here today will lead to a really educational and fascinating discussion. And I'm really excited to hear from them on this topic of social perceptions regarding environmental effects of offshore wind. So let me, in that presentation, I want to bring up one other, Margaret, let me make sure I can share my slides and you can, let's see.
We don't need to use my slides. It was
Okay.
kind of a last minute thing. So it's okay, Chris. We can just move what you have already. Okay.
Okay.
Let's do
perfect. Am I still sharing the screen? Maybe I'll stop sharing.
You are sharing your screen.
Okay. So again, thank you so much for your time today. Let's dive into some questions. These are open for all four of you. Feel comfortable to weigh in if you've got thoughts. If not, totally fine. They're we want this to be really more of a discussion. But maybe starting with the first one, in your experience, are environmental interactions a driving factor influencing support or opposition to offshore wind energy? And how do you, in your conversations and work with different groups, talk about or contextualize all the uncertainties that surround these interactions and really this kind of complex issue of environmental interactions in wind energy? And I'll just open it up because I don't want to call on anyone. Yeah, go ahead.
I can jump in. Hi, everyone. So I have been studying sort of support and opposition of wind energy in a number of different regions, mostly on the Atlantic coast here in the US. And environmental interactions, positive or negative, are absolutely a driving factor behind support for and opposition to offshore wind. This has been found pretty extensively in studies that are using a lot of different types of data, whether it's an empirical study, doing interviews, reading public comments, attending public meetings. This comes up a lot. And for example, in some of my research, we have found that both supporters and opponents select wildlife issues particularly as one of their top criterion for support or opposition. And we tend to find that opponents are even more likely to cite environmental factors as their top issue in helping them form their decision around what is their attitude, whether or not they're going to support a particular wind farm. When we look even deeper into some of these data, we find that marine mammal interactions come up quite a lot. And I don't think that's probably a surprise to anybody, but that's very frequently discussed in sort of public meetings. It's discussed in one-on-one conversations. And the public is really quite concerned about what are the environmental interactions. When we look at some of this in empirical models, so when we build different types of either stated or revealed choice models, this comes up as a significant factor driving support or opposition. And so, I think that this is a critical issue, and it's really important that we're talking about this today. I did also want to say, though, I think that environmental interactions are couched within a more complex set of values that people have. So it's something that is easy for people to discuss, right? And in driving attitudes, but it's sort of one factor among a more complex and deeper set of shared values of how we think about our world and what our mental model is for the world today and the world of the future. But those are maybe just a couple of opening remarks, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of that, but I open the floor to some of my fellow panelists.
And I'm happy to follow Allison. I think the statement that I want to make, because this meeting is being recorded, is just that I wanted to make sure that anything I say today is just coming from me. Any mistakes that I make are mine. I'm not presenting really on behalf of the West Coast Ocean Tribal Caucus. I am here or any of the West Coast tribes. I am a citizen member of the Confederated Tribes of Coos-Lourom-Quans. I used to, like Chris said, but from conversations that I've had with tribes, and this kind of folds into a little bit of what Alison was saying, related to values, is that really at the core of tribal identity is like culture, and that all culture is deeply connected, right, to the environment and everything around in tribal areas. So the ocean, stories are connected to the environment, all of nature. It's all woven together. And so tribes really have that feeling of like an environmental impact doesn't just affect the environment, right? It's affecting their connection to the environment. And I would just say that connection to like tradition, ancestral ways, places, all of that. And so impacts to I just wanted to give some examples. So impacts to a view shed would be, might disrupt the ceremonial location or some of those events. And so that, it's very deep. It's in any way that the environment is affected, not just kind of those typical environmental impacts that people think about, but things like, wind and view sheds and locations that are very specific, and the feeling of those locations, not just impacts to environmental, like a species or an ecosystem or something like that, which obviously are very connected to cultural identity. And I'll yield the floor because I feel like other people probably want to weigh in. But obviously fishing is a really big one too, right? So when you think about fishing, you not only have the economy of a tribe, you have the traditional practice of the tribe, and then oftentimes fish are seen as relations to the tribe themselves, people that they have to respect and care for. And so in that way, I think the typical way of framing of the environment is very much connected to how the tribe would consider, opposition or support for offshore wind, because that's going to affect them on a very personal level.
Chris, I'll jump in. This is Chris Olith with the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind. And I mean, what's interesting is, being kind of coming from the developer sector for most of my career and now being with this nonprofit, but, kind of spending the bulk of my years with different private sector developers. it's very rare to see the private sector and NGOs and the environmental community come together to band for something. Typically we see a developer and then it's being opposed by, different environmental groups. And so for me, it was just such a beautiful alliance and so heartening to see so many and, by and large, the lion's share of environmental groups supporting offshore wind, kind of recognizing the environmental benefits that, certainly not to dismiss impacts, but to recognize, essentially most every environmental group recognizing the great threats of climate change and how that is the underpinning for anything that's existing on our planet. I think sometimes what has happened to take that, we don't want to take that for granted and then use that as an excuse to allow for impacts that are at a population level or in a way that are, creating, kind of an undue impact to the environment. So I think it's been really interesting to kind of have that juxtaposition. And it's been, really heartening to work in that space along with the NGO community. And, the kind of the various threads that run through, certainly also not a monolithic group, but, kind of recognizing that. And also I would just add that on impacts, environmental impacts, you know, we haven't really known what the impacts will be or have been until, this recent, finally development of offshore wind projects. And so, really important, all the research that's continuing to happen, the monitoring before, during, and after construction and during operations to understand what those impacts are. Because I think if we can accurately communicate what impacts are, it's just a more transparent and honest conversation to have with anyone who's engaged. And I guess, Allison, I would, not to usurp the moderator role, but I would be curious at some point to know if data are actually changing the minds of folks when they are opposed to a project for an environmental reason, if there are data that show that, for example, that impact may not be, what they had expected or justified. Like, does that ever change a mind? But that's just my question. Chris may or may not allow that to be answered.
I don't know, Chris, do you want to leave that to Allison or do you want to jump in?
Sarah, why don't you weigh in and then we can go to Alison.
Okay, great.
I think it's a great question.
So similarly, I'm here with the Department of, I work at the Department of Energy. I'm here in a role more, I think, on work I did before I joined the department. I'm in the S3 vertical, so we actually don't deal with wind, though we do deal with transmission that would be associated with wind. But I would just say, I think human condition, we have a very special relationship with the ocean. We have a very special relationship to the wildlife in the ocean. And I think to Chris's point that, there is more openness perhaps in the NGO community working on offshore wind because of the recognition of climate change. I think that's true. And I think it's because the oceans are shifting at such a fast and terrifying scale that as people who care about the ocean, you want to make it happen. I think on the other hand, because it's moving at such a fast and terrifying scale at all times, these big decisions are also kind of terrifying because I've only worked on offshore wind in the Pacific. We really don't have enough information about how that development work in the Pacific. And, it is so different from the Atlantic. It's not clear like what exactly could be transposed over. And so I think, and I would say also like the BOEM process, which kind of like gives you the lease area before some of this work done is also like not really conducive necessarily to like building some of that trust that you might otherwise get through like a planning effort where you had more of a role in identifying areas. But I think one thing that is heartening is the role of adaptive management. And because the ocean is changing so fast, and because we really don't know these impacts of the technology, getting real management plans in there. So as that data comes in, there is a commitment to project changes as they go. Is something watching the ocean
Sarah, you're you're breaking up quite a bit. I don't know how to
And
maybe.
they understand we're, just like might have that. So they're just being put, not all projects have those structures, but they're
Such interesting perspective too. I really wanted to hear what that was.
Um, yeah, Sarah, unfortunately, maybe having that video off will help your bandwidth. But maybe in the meantime, getting back to your question, Chris, regarding as we learn more and as we collect data and get results, does that influence the conversation? Does that help, um, you know, change people's minds on perceptions? And maybe Alison, if you want to start off with that, and then if others have thoughts, they can certainly weigh in.
Sure. I'm happy to start a discussion on that. It's a tricky question. There's a lot of researchers trying to figure out how do we change attitudes. And this, I think, is particularly true when it came to, beliefs around climate change. How do we get the public to, accept what the science is saying about climate change, right? So we talk a lot about, what are some of can we change people's minds? I think from my perspective, you know, I guess I'll just say from my perspective, doing attitudinal research and looking at perceptions, whether it's environmental or if there's other cultural connections and landscape attachment, for example, that come up. When we're doing this type of research, we really try to avoid, try to increase acceptance or sort of change people's minds. So I just wanted to say that I know that wasn't your question, but it comes up a lot. People ask that a lot: is how do we change people's minds? And I think it's really important as a scientific community that we don't think about studying how people are perceiving a project or a wind farm with the intent of changing minds. And that because I think it can help us really listen. And I think the short answer is, is there data that shows, that more information might change people's minds? I haven't seen a lot of data that shows this. What I have seen, and what I found in my own research, and I think there may be some studies that do show a strong change of opinion, but I think it's probably fairly limited. But I have seen a fair amount of change of intensity of opinion. So people tend to sort of lean one way or the other towards support or towards opposition. And through conversation and discourse, people's attitudes change, right? People's perceptions and attitudes are not fixed at any one given point in time, but they tend to be driven by, all of these different factors. And with more information, sometimes people's concerns can be alleviated. But what we've often been finding is where people tend to land on that, if you're sort of neutral here, where you might change from being a strong supporter to a sort of less strong supporter and maybe move, back and forth, but not always crossing over that support or opposition line very often. And I think that is true in my research. I was looking at some of the studies that I'd done, just kind of looking back over the past really 10 or 15 years, and then looking at some data that I just collected to see, well, what was actually happening with people's change in perceptions. And we don't see a lot of change from support to opposition or opposition to support with more information. But what we do find is that more information can really empower people to be more engaged in discourse around offshore wind. And I think this is really important if we're thinking about a justice-based energy transition. When people lack information, they often don't feel like they have enough information to maybe show up at public events or to participate in written comments or things that might be publicly available. or, they don't want to sound uninformed when talking with their neighbors or other trusted folks. So making more information available, I think, really can help procedurally with opening up engagement opportunities for more people. So I do think that that's a really important point that I wanted to bring up. But, certainly attitudes are not fixed. And what we hear a lot in my sort of research world is that people are really asking for more information, and that's particularly true in the environmental piece. There's a lot of, I heard that there might be this impact, but I don't know I don't know if it's true or not. And that's true whether people are opponents or if they're supporters of an energy project. There's a lot of knowledge that there could be environmental interactions out there. So I do think that there's a lot of benefit in having more information into the public space. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's a first start.
Yeah, thanks. And so maybe talking about, relaying information, receiving information from, sorry, Margaret, did you want to weigh in on that conversation? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say something. I really appreciate what Allison just said, and I wanted to just share that, I think if I kind of flip it a little bit to thinking about like I said, I'm not speaking on behalf, but maybe just think about how I've heard it phrased before, or ways to think about it is just tribes have kind of been waiting to change people's minds about the way that they are living and share the information that they have about nature, respect, and all of their cultural practices, and how those can provide good stewardship and a good way of life and a good way to live for other people for a long time as well. And I think they, maybe some of that, the trying to think about how to have conversations, there really needs to be a lot of mutual respect there, and an understanding like they've experienced historically, a lot of injustice and a lot of people telling them that things are going to work out. And then that hasn't happened. And I think that they've been trying to tell people, here's maybe a good thing to think about, or here's why you should be including us. Because if you include us in the conversation, then we can participate more actively and we can provide you with some ideas. We are experts, right? And so there really needs to be more coming together at the table and building trust around the table. And I think if that was done in a real way and in a meaningful way, and there was, those conversations happened and people were really listening, kind of like Allison just kind of referred to, I think, instead of like thinking about what they're bringing in before they come and sit at that table, I think that would be super helpful. So I'll stop.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think it is important to remember that these conversations should be both ways, right? It's not just one direction, researchers or whoever talking to the local community, but it needs to be a dialogue to learn from the expertise of the people that are there and have been there for a long time. So I really appreciate that comment into the discussion. And you also you mentioned, building trust. And so I think one of the one question we could talk about is who are trusted messengers for talking about this? Are researchers considered trusted messengers? Government agencies, industry. So I'll pose that question to you. Who do you think are trusted messengers? And if they're not initially, how do different groups maybe earn that trust to have these conversations with local communities?
I can jump here. I think it's entirely dependent on the community. I wouldn't walk in assuming there's a lot of trust of your federal government or of your state government. I would say in California it's a little bit different. I think we do have some well-trusted state folks, and I think the local government is highly dependent. It's completely dependent on the region and the electorate and how engaged they are, how bought out they seem to be by like the chamber and business. I have found, I really think the role of local scientists is important, and that's, researchers that might be associated with an academic institution or those with local lived experience, tribal, natural, and cultural resources specialists, and then just I think that the researchers and perhaps like I would more put like wildlife experts that are embedded in the communities and again are seeing like the day-to-day changes, because I think people are really less interested in these big systems. Like at a systems level, this is going to be great. Like this is going to really help with climate change, and systems level, it will help all the whales. But what they're really, we are people that tend to be local, and you want to know like how is it going to affect the migrations that I see all the time. And I think there's also a good role for some of the local NGOs that, are kind of, again, like leading wildlife work or maybe local schools. And I think there's also, I put this, I don't know if this is the trusted messenger or another question, but I think there's a real role for community science, working with on the ground folks who are like daily engaging with the ocean in some way, either like as fishermen or sustenance fishermen or just kind of those walks or organizations. And I think it's important to bring those folks in too, because they really have such a good understanding of the daily changes they're seeing.
Yeah, and Chris, I would just add on to that. I think, kind of like in tandem to what Sarah was saying, that oftentimes the folks who are in the roles that she was describing are, they have existing relationships. And for me, that is, usually the thread that can pull together a trusted messenger is, even if the scientist needs to be introduced by someone who is a trusted messenger, and that's how the conduit happens. But really having those local gatekeepers who have the existing relationships convey the information or make the introduction to someone they trust. In my experience, anyhow, thoroughly unscientifically, just spending all the time in the community, that's what's made differences.
Go ahead, Margaret.
I looked at this question, I think not for too long, but I tend to think like, hopefully you are the trusted messenger, the researcher. I know that we just kind of went into like having those meaningful discussions, but I think what really needs to happen is, you should try to become that trusted messenger. If you're not, that should be the goal, because I think if you aren't, why not? Like, why can't you be? Why can't you be a person that's ready to come to the table and have conversation and be authentic with those other, the community? And I know that like, we all have different levels of roles in an organization, but it's really important, to take that responsibility on. I think for the local communities, they really want to hear, they really want you to be engaged. They really want to have face-to-face conversations with researchers, with the primary investigators. They really want to have those people engage in their community to really understand and hear what they're saying. Because if you don't have that relationship, then sometimes you just won't ever have that kind of trusted messenger perspective. But I mean, that's just one way. I know that there's probably more than one way. So that's just the one that I thought of. So.
Alison, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of the things that are being said, that it's super locally dependent. And I think, when we're looking to do engagement with a community that might be, affected in some way, there's a transmission line, there's going to be maybe a port will get developed, or there's a viewshed, or whatever it is, when a community has been identified, which I should say a community is not always geographic, right? A community might be defined in different ways. I think we often tend to go to that geographic definition. So thinking about who is the community that we're talking about might change who we think the trusted messenger might be. But it could be someone that's not really very connected to policy or decision making. But I think what Margaret was saying, or Chris, what everyone is actually saying about identifying some of the individuals that are very present and can help connect that research community, I think is really critical. And I think we're in the research community, we're very well aware that there's a real gap in disseminating some of the knowledge back to the public and like playing a stronger role in science communication. This is not something that many scientists are not very well trained in or very comfortable in this, but many of us have been in situations where we've seen misinformation sort of run rampant in public fora because the people with the information maybe aren't there or are not empowered, or maybe it doesn't feel like a safe space to be able to share, scientific data. So that's, I think, increasingly a challenge that we should think about as a research community of what are some of the more effective ways that we can communicate back and have better engagements with the public.
Great. So with that, as maybe from your perspectives and the work that you're doing, do you feel like you have enough resources, or those that work with communities have enough resources? Is there enough capacity to have these conversations with the community, different communities? And if not, if the resources and capacity isn't there, how do we improve that so that we do have productive exchanges of information and perspectives?
Well, I can offer one thought. I think that as a researcher myself, something that we often look at is funding cycles. And, if you're talking about, do we have resources to be able to disseminate this information and build those relationships? Relationship building takes a lot of time, and doing engaged work and having these productive and trusted partnerships isn't a one-off thing that happens when there's a 2-year funding cycle. So I think sometimes when we look to the type of research that's being funded, I think that the public communication aspect and engagement pieces are sometimes they sometimes happen at the end, or maybe they don't happen at all because the empirical data collection is happening during those sort of critical years of grant funding. So as someone who operates in that space as a researcher, that is certainly an area. I think that the federal agencies are doing a really good job at shifting thinking around that. But that in the past has certainly been a challenge among the social science research community anyway.
I would just say in terms of resources available, we've, I've, kind of typically seen in engaging with communities that unfortunately it's the ones who have the least resources are the ones who arguably we kind of need their voices most. And so we, end up in this conundrum where, they're under-resourced, so maybe can't participate as well in some of the public processes, particularly related to social and environmental justice issues. And so if we're really creating a just transition, it's challenging to do without those specific voices in the room and being amplified. And so I think the question of resourcing them is something that, for example, philanthropy has been very engaged in trying to figure out a solution for and contributing to, but certainly has presented a challenge overall.
And we don't have our other speaker on, so I'm just gonna jump in. But just thinking about well, obviously I think tribes need to be receiving this funding directly. There's a lot of experts that the tribes could be hiring, but they oftentimes have one person wearing about like all the hats that they could possibly wear at any given time. And so when you're asking that person to engage, they do want to engage, but they might not have the time to engage. And so thinking about how to create funding that is available to them. And this kind of goes back to what Alison was just saying about how, like maybe there's more money that's like being kind of, I don't know if it's if it's actually being accepted, that we're looking at relationships more, and we're looking at maybe not quantifiable outcomes at every single time we're doing a funding cycle. That is very helpful, because that is those types of outcomes, like those products, do not prioritize relationships. They do not prioritize inclusion of other types of information. They don't prioritize a pace that makes sense for including tribes, in my opinion. And then I think obviously with tribes directly, these are huge burdens. And so when you compare some of the funding that's gone into like some of the research for offshore wind, tribes haven't been don't have access to that same resource, but it's not quite coming down the pipeline for them yet. So there's projects that are being funding, research projects that are being funding, but there's no funding going directly to tribes to provide money for their research. And this kind of falls back a little bit to just trust and kind of having good data. But obviously, the tribes, hire experts and hire people to kind of have two-eyed seeing, right? Like they get to see this kind of research perspective, and then they also get to see like more conventional research perspective, and then they also see the tribe's way of seeing, which is like, indigenous knowledge and many years of like knowledge from people, and they talk to elders oftentimes when they're integrated into the tribes. So like having a person at the tribes do that work is a really important way to or I guess it's an important thing to have, because they can like fold those things together as an expert. And so I don't have an answer for solving that problem. I just know that it's very much needed. And then those researchers or those people that are hired by the tribes, I think it'd be great to engage it with other researchers and provide a more of a network, right? So I'll stop there, but thanks.
Yeah, great. Maybe start with a couple of questions from the audience, and one kind of relates to funding and also this conversation about trusted messengers. So the first question we received is, as researchers and experts in the space who are not supposed to have bias, how do you answer community concerns around funding for your research? So for example, if a study is funded by an offshore wind developer or a federal agency that has a directive to advance administration goals, for example, how do you address community members who might have a distrust of the results because of who funded the study?
Well, this is something that I encounter quite a bit when I'm working with, when I'm doing public engagement and working with communities and data collection. And I will say that like nobody is really without bias, right? And I think that I guess the way that I've sort of come around to this is that the best that we can do is be transparent and honest about where we sit in this game. So very recently, I was working with some fishing communities in Maine around floating wind and this sort of idea of co-location or coexistence, which is fraught and contested. And this is a really challenging space for a lot of reasons. And I think that what we've learned is that we need to be immediately upfront and fully transparent about the funding sources and be able to hear and listen to people's concerns about funding agencies. But in addition to the funding agencies, people want to know, even before they'll talk to me sometimes, they want to know what my position is, right? Do I support or do I oppose wind energy in this place or in this context or in this space? And being able to have that open dialogue is really a way to open up a trusted line of communication. So I think that it's really tricky, because that's true that we're not supposed to be biased, but we are all human, and we all have we come to the table with all of our past experiences that shape our perceptions and the way that we even approach our research. So I think that just being really transparent is critical. Also, I think we have to acknowledge that sometimes funding agencies, that can be a limitation in how we collect data. And there have been instances where, we might think really hard about, can we accept funding from this one source or not, to be able to do the work that we want to do based on past relationships, right? So if we're thinking about past relationships with a certain community, we might go back to, well, is that community being regulated by X? What's the history here? And that it's a real, I acknowledge it, that can be a real challenge that doesn't always have a simple solution, but I do think that transparency and real honesty is the best approach, even if it puts you on a different side of the table with somebody that you're working with.
Yeah, and Chris, I would just add, also kind of, having the developer background. So kind of being sometimes the ones who have looked for researchers to advance a certain topic area. And, it's certainly challenging for researchers, and they have, we know that they've accepted funding from offshore wind developers. But once they do that, having transparency, as Alison was saying, of the funding source, but then through the process of how the funding is applied and how the research is designed and how they can continue to participate and observe the process and the outcomes. So it's not just kind of this black box where the money just disappears and then there's something that comes out the other side. And I think that can just add, having citizens advisory groups and others who can just kind of continue to monitor and ensure that, there's daylight on the process. I think that can be helpful and comforting as well. I mean, the money needs to come from somewhere, right? So,
Yeah.
and the developers are the ones who, they're the ones who are the proponents of the project. So in that case, it seems appropriate, but how it's shepherded, I think, makes the difference.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Margaret.
I'll be really quick. I would just say, maybe, I mean, I think that honesty is really important. I think that's already been said. Maybe just don't stop being transparent, don't stop, communicating. But I would say you might be out of luck. There might not be a resolution. You might just be not able to build that trust. You might always have that biased perception. And that's maybe something to just accept and not stop it from, just kind of still communicating, I guess. Because I don't think that not being transparent about what you're doing and not being honest about what you're doing is the answer. I think just keeping doing that no matter what, because in some cases you're just not gonna you're not gonna be able to win somebody over. And that's okay. You could still have maybe another type of relationship with that person, even if it's not about that particular area. Just remember you're a human and don't have a relationship related to that subject, right? That would be good.
I think it's important for researchers I think there's a real opportunity to collaborate with what community wants researched. Because they often do have a research need or interest that might come out of that project or be unrelated to or tangentially related to a specific species. And I think that's often like a great point of collaboration, like understanding what their research needs are and working together around that. I think I haven't seen that so much, in offshore wind, but in some of these early, very contentious solar projects in California, where there was an adaptive management plan, a committee that came out of there. And then and I think the researchers sometimes associated with were, they went to developer side, and that was quite recognized in some of their work. But then there was also opportunity through that to address research needs for the same species they cared about, and led to some productive outcomes and long-term trust building through like a kind of shared interest.
Great, thanks. I think one other thing, transparency is key. Chris, I think you mentioned like advisory committees. That can always be helpful so that you've got different perspectives that are helping design the research. peer review is another thing that can help add credibility to research so that, I mean, that's kind of in the academic space, but, if others are involved with it, that can help with maybe the bias of where the funding came from. We got a couple of questions that I think are kind of similar, so I'll just combine these. It's related to disinformation, misinformation. How do we deal with this? How do we yeah, that can be a real challenge, obviously, if someone has a perception of something that maybe might be misinformed or read something that is counter to the science and the research. So, in your experiences, how do you, yeah, how do you address misinformation, disinformation?
I'll kick it off. I think, one is a huge topic, could be the whole webinar. But one thing that for me, the first thing I like to do is actually really try to understand if it is disinformation, so kind of willfully generating facts that have no bearing on reality, or if it's misinformation where it's kind of like an honest repeating of things folks have heard that may not be accurate. And so like what is the intent? Where where is kind of what is the what is the origin of why folks are volunteering that? And I think that for me, how I respond depends a lot on which category those two are coming from. First thing I'll say, but there's a lot to say, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, this is a really tricky topic. I think not just in the offshore wind space, but in many spaces is sort of how do we combat and battle this? And as media, is perceived to be increasingly biased, so people's sources of information tend to come from sometimes very polarized places. And yeah, I don't know how to answer this question succinctly. I think that encouraging people, and including ourselves, to seek both sides of kind of a story, I think can be important. And trying to step outside of our box a little bit because, freely available information may be cited. So trying to understand each other a little bit more and come back together. It feels sometimes like the public has become a bit divided, and I won't say more on that at this moment, but collectively, thinking about like trying to listen to the other side a little bit more that might have different perspectives and other media sources might be useful. I do think that something that I've been seeing quite a lot recently, particularly around misinformation, is in big public events, questions will get asked. And if there aren't, and often this is related to environmental information, actually. And if there's not a ready answer or an expert sort of willing to step up or out of a comfort zone to talk about that, or maybe the actual precise fact isn't available, that then information or that opportunity is missed, or the opportunity to dispel that misinformation is missed. And then it can sometimes explode on social media in other ways and sort of is perpetuated. And we've seen this in the last, like this is happening at public events. And I don't think there's a quick and easy fix, but we might think about how, what are the different ways that we're doing public engagement, and how to prepare for some of that, and what types of information do we want to be available with, or do we want to bring other experts or folks who might be willing to step up and sort of weigh in on some of these topics. Certainly in some of the spaces that I've been working in, I've heard some misinformation continue to get repeated over and over again. And I think a lot of people say, well, we know that that's not true, but you might not have the fact in front of you and maybe not feel comfortable engaging in that conversation. So, maybe thinking a little bit more on how we plan some of these events and doing them in a different way than we've done them in the past might be worth thinking through.
Just on that last point that Alison has made about kind of rethinking outreach. I think that, if you really want to address some of this, like having that communication directly with the tribes, not just, like providing information in big forums, but really reaching out and providing the information and answers that they are looking for, and if they're asking questions, following up with the questions they're asking, and not in a, a form sort of way, like here's a research article link to this fact that you ask about, really tying it and connecting it and making kind of digesting what question they ask you and then answering it in a way that you're answering the question they ask you, not just the generic question, not just the generic fact, but like that more specific question, like really trying to hear that and understand why they have that question, will help, I think, understand what answer you're going to give and provide, and if that is satisfactory. And then there's just a whole bunch of reflection, I think, that happens when you do that, and then you provide a response that's maybe more meaningful and not just about like a tidbit of misinformation. But I'm coming from a totally different place, a place where I just share, make a space for tribes to talk. I'm not like sharing information out to tribes on like research. I'm just like sharing broadly information that I see and find available to them, right? Like webinars like this one, and I'm just sharing information like that. I'm not sharing information on specific projects, right? And so I think I have just a little bit different take on that.
It's also like I think with engagement generally, you should be clear what the outcome is. So if you were engaging, and then there's not really going to be a point to influence back the decision that will ultimately be made, that can be pretty frustrating and like long term, like not really engender, like, not really help you with long-term support to keep giving information about your project. And then you get a reaction, and then that's like really not the information you're really looking for, or you're not really like clear what the type of information you could get back to, then how that would like connect to a project decision making or another decision making. And I think being very clear starting the engagement, like this is an engagement to get feedback, and this is how this feedback will be incorporated, or this is just like this is just an information sharing one way, like is pretty helpful. And I think also like really creating those you are working with the community to get their like expertise and experience, and that should be incorporated, that is valuable, and it's not just like a check the box meeting. So I think that's helpful. I think to your another question, I'm just going to talk before I get kicked off of the internet again, so I'll like do two at once, is, wind and wildlife, or renewable energy and wildlife, is such a horribly hard issue because there are real conflicts and it gets co-opted. So there's real information and there's misinformation, and usually in the misinformation there is real information. So I think it's like, how do you keep both in? If you purely say, oh my gosh, this is misinformation, that doesn't work for you long term. That I don't think that works for like our renewable energy industry getting to scale, because people are smart and they like eventually see through that. So I think it's like that kernel of like, okay, yes, this is true. There are going to be impacts to whales and birds, and like we are working on it, and we're going to set up structures through adaptive management plans and like other pieces along the way to have environmental safeguards to take care of these things, rather than just saying like, oh no, that's crazy. Even if what the purpose of that information that someone else, the kernel they took, was just really to stop the project, to stop the industry. And I think it's really hard to hold that balance.
This hour has flown by so fast, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you, Chris, Allison, Margaret, Sarah, for your time today. We could talk for hours. You all have careers, doing this work. So there's a lot we didn't get to cover, but appreciate your time, appreciate the work that you're doing. And everybody who joined today, thank you for your time as well. And yeah, let's just close out the webinar and hope everybody has a good rest of your week.
Uh-oh.